Hello and welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery DIY Friends and Family Workshop. Today, we're going to explore sustainable practices and materials through printmaking with Tracy Featherstone. We'll hear from the artist first, gather our materials, and work through the project step by step. Feel free to pause and work at your own pace.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited you're joining us for this workshop today. The process that we're going to be using is a printmaking process called pochoir. And pochoir is simply a French word for stencil. The process is also inspired by drawings. I call them drawings from the universe that I see out in the world while I'm taking my daily walks. There are things like spray paint marks left by construction workers to indicate an area that needs work, or cracks in the sidewalk, things like that. So this process that we're going through and the work in the exhibition that's related to this is inspired by these drawings from the universe. So before you start, it's important to plan your work area. So you want to cover your space and get out all your materials so you're ready to have some fun. If you're working with spray paint, you need to find a well-ventilated space to use it. So like a garage, things like that. It's a good idea with the spray paint to wear a respirator and gloves to protect yourself while you're using the aerosol. If you don't have a place to work with spray paint, or you don't have the protective gear, you can also do this process using acrylic paint and a sponge or a stencil brush. So both things will yield pretty good results. So other materials you may need are thick paper or canvas as your background. So you can do this on fabric or on paper. If you're a quilter out here, this is a really fun way to get some interesting textures that you can then turn into another textile piece. You'll need either spray paint or acrylic paint. If you're using acrylic paint, you'll need a sponge or a stencil brush to apply the paint. Spray paint just goes straight out of the can. Scissors or X-Acto knife to do some collage and cut your own stencils if that's something you like to do. And then other mixed media materials such as glitter or sewing supplies, drawing supplies, and embellishments that you will use towards the end of the process to finish up your work. As far as stencils go, the main part of this project, you can use a lot of different things for stencils. You can go out around the neighborhood and hunt for interesting leaves or shapes or discarded materials that have an interesting shape or holes in them. So you can use found objects. You can purchase stencils or find stencils pre-made stencils are already around the house. Things like letters and numbers or simple shapes. And then thirdly, you can make your own handmade stencils. So if there's a shape that you like to use or a specific design, feel free to cut out several of your own stencils to put in your supply bag there to pull out and use during this process. So here's an example of the stencils I pulled together for the workshop. You can see there's a big variety. You can use both the positive and the negative parts of the stencils. Both yield interesting results in this process. So first step is laying down your background. So again, you can be working on either textile or paper. And don't worry too much in the beginning about where you're putting each thing or what the result will be. This is an improvisational process. So part of what we're doing is making a mark and then responding to that mark and doing another layer. So this is just the first step. So right now, sort of lay your stencils out on your surface, and we'll see what the results end up being. You're going to either spray or sponge inside or around the outside of the stencil area onto your surface. If you're using a sponge, make sure the sponge is on the dry side. If there's too much water in the sponge, it tends to kind of make the paint too runny and it'll leak underneath the stencil. So keep your sponge dry or use a stencil brush. And then spray paint should be spray paint, you can also use interesting tips on your spray paint cans that yield different marks, but you can play with holding the spray can close to the paper and getting a more direct, precise mark, or holding the spray paint can farther away from the paper so there's a bigger width of the spray coming out onto the surface. Next, remove the stencils and look at the results that you have. So I think when I'm looking at this demo here, there's some interesting areas where I really like the way that the paints are starting to mix. The yellow and violet paints start to make a really interesting neutral color. I like to see the little fine texture details underneath the mesh on the top left-hand side of the piece. And I kind of am interested in the little comb E-like positive shape towards the right-hand side of the page. So those are things that I might want to try to preserve or work around in the next step. So one way to preserve the areas that I like is to put a positive stencil over top of that area. And so that essentially blocks out, when I'm doing additional layers, other things happening to that area. Another thing you can do is use just plain masking tape to lay that over top of the things that you find interesting, and that'll help block that area out. Or you can throw care at the wind and see what happens in your next layer. But this is the time where you sort of look, be surprised what came out, and then respond to that surprise and start to build up additional layers. So repeat steps 1 to 3 to create depth and layers as many times as you'd like. The more layers that you have, you'll have dense, opaque areas and lighter, more ephemeral areas, and it'll start to kind of give this illusion of space. So some shapes will appear to be floating closer to you while other shapes go into the background. The last step is to use your additional materials such as collage, glitter. In this particular example, there's graphite added, so little graphite drawings with ruler and pencil added to the stencil part. I liked the way I tried to use the line so it augmented some of the interesting shapes that were happening, and it also responded to the grid-like marks that came from the mesh that was laid on top. In this particular piece, you can see a different type of graphite drawing. And one of the things I wanted to mention, because I really like this area, is on the left-hand side, the kind of stripes or structure that's happening there. That's simply just a piece of masking tape laid over the grid that gave that sort of shadow shape effect when I was doing the multiple layers. In this piece, I used sewing or stitching to create another kind of mark. So there's graphite drawing throughout the piece. You can see it wrapping around in kind of a little maze format. It's making the triangles and then circling around one of the white shapes in the center. But on the bottom of the piece, there's stitched marks, which make little kind of hatching marks, but it's thread going into the paper. And it's also functional because it's holding the piece of mesh that I collaged directly onto the paper. If you are sewing into paper, it's a good idea to punch little holes for your needle to go into the paper first. It just makes the sewing go a lot easier, and you can do a few holes at a time and then sew, and then a few more holes and then sew. So that way you're not ripping the paper when you're trying to go through and sew. And then this is another example where the mesh is sewn directly onto the page. And one of the things that I like that's starting to happen here is, because I use the mesh several times, it has a layer of spray paint on it, and it starts to react to what's happening on the paper that was the background layer that I was starting to build up. And this also has some graphite marks on it. And then these are the final pieces that you can see at the Rife Gallery. You can see they look really different when you get them all framed up and presented in the beautiful space at the Rife. So hopefully you'll find some fun inspiration and make your own work, your own finished pochoir piece. Thank you for joining.
If you'd like to hear more or see more from Tracy Featherstone, be sure to check her out at her website as well as Instagram. There's great stuff to follow. Thank you again for joining us for Shift, Thinking Globally, Acting Locally, Friends and Family Workshop with Tracy Featherstone. I'd like to give a special thank you to Maria Sater-Reeder, the curator of this exhibition, and to the Governor's Office, the Ohio Legislature, and the Ohio Arts Council's board who support this great space.